it was stuff leading up to the Revolutionary War, and we're going to go over that just a little bit again. I have a few questions for you.
All right.
You have no quiz this morning, so that's nice, right? Okay, so the road to revolution, we've talked about it a little bit. So let's talk about it a little bit more. In chapter 4, in the first section, it talks about one of the early attempts that was made to keep the Europeans from invading Indian territory, and that was the Proclamation Line of 1763. And the Proclamation Line, can anyone tell me where that line was drawn? Right across the top of the Appalachian Mountains. It was a very reasonable, easy to define line, so it was a good idea. But the Europeans would not obey staying on their side of the Proclamation Line. Virginians and other colonists wanted to go west, and their question was, isn't the continent ours as much as it is the Indians? That's a really good question indeed. Well, isn't it ours just as much as it is theirs? So they went ahead to invade the Indian territory. What do you think about the answer to that question? Do you have any opinion? Nobody has an opinion. Yes?
The statement is true, it's both of theirs, but the Indians already have it.
Right. Right. Land is, it depends on how you're looking at this, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like using the statement almost selfishly, because they kind of say, well, it's both of ours, and then go in and take it.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, if it's both of ours, can't we both live together here then? That wasn't their idea at all, was it? If they're saying it's just as much ours as yours, but they're kicking them out. And so it didn't go over well. It didn't go over well, and that was just one of many, 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 many promises broken to the Indians. They would be moved to a new area and told this is where they'd get to stay for life, and it wouldn't be too bad, and then they'd be moved again, and it's a long story. You'll be hearing about it in U.S. history. But the first act that irritated the colonists was what? The Sugar Act. The Sugar Act. But they already had a Sugar Act, and the Sugar Act was lowering the sugar tax from 6% to 3%, and all of a sudden the colonists get mad. What's with that?
Because
Joseph.
It wasn't enforced before.
Okay, it wasn't enforced. So 6% of nothing is a lot better than 3% of everything. So they weren't paying the 6%, but now what did they do with this Sugar Act? They sent officials to enforce it and collect the taxes, and the people were not very happy about it. This is just a quick review. What was the next act that upset the colonists? Stamp Act. If you look in your book on page 79, you can see the embossed stamp that was required to be put on any literature that was sold in the country. You had to buy this stamp, and it worked. When you used it, I don't know exactly how it worked, but you had to pay. And so the people didn't like that because they were making their own paper, they were printing their own things. Why should they have to pay a tax to England? And so they weren't happy about it. They argued about it, and they sent their complaints to England, and their reaction was very negative. So what did England do next in 1766? The Stamp Act was 65. 66. What did they do with that Stamp Act? What did they do with the Stamp Act?
They got rid of it.
They got rid of it. They said, okay, forget the Stamp Act. You don't have to do it. However, what? Declaratory Act. What were they saying in the Declaratory Act? However, we're still in charge. It's our idea, not yours. We're not doing the Stamp Act, but that's because we don't want to do it anymore. It's not you. You are the child. We are the parent. So next thing they send over is the Townshend Acts. What did they tax in the Townshend Acts? Well, tea was the big one, but also lead, paper, glass, I think. So they taxed several things: lead, glass, paper, and paint, but the big one was tea. And why were they so upset about a tea tax? Does anybody have an idea?
They were already taxed on tea.
They were already taxed on tea? Anybody else have a different idea why they were upset?
Drink tea always.
Yeah, that was like really important to them, tea. In fact, we're a coffee drinking country today, right? Coffee shops are more popular than tea shops.
There's tea shops.
Yeah, there are tea shops.
Is that like a tea bar?
But there are some tea shops, but you see coffee shops everywhere. And do you know this is the reason? Real patriots decided they were going to drink coffee instead of tea. This is when coffee became popular in America. If it hadn't been for the Townsend Acts, we'd probably all still be drinking tea. Maybe to our advantage, I don't know. There's arguments. One year they say coffee's good for you, the next they say it isn't. Right now it's good for you. So I'm real happy about that. There's lots of articles you can read online about the benefits of coffee. And yet this is when we started being coffee drinkers at this time period, because John Adams wrote a letter to his wife, and I remember he said to her, I've got to learn to drink this coffee stuff, because he asked for tea in a tavern when he was traveling, and the woman got mad at him for not being a loyal patriot by drinking tea. So they were really in earnest about this. We're not taking their tea, and if we have to go without tea, we will. Well, that was pretty serious. It's like coffee drinkers today giving up their coffee for a cause. That's not an easy thing to do. So they did it. And they were still upset about this tea tax when the incident happened with the soldiers in Boston. What was the incident with the soldiers in Boston? The Boston Massacre. Can someone tell me a little bit about this Boston? Tony.
Basically, they were the colonists, and they were throwing like snowballs and stuff at the soldiers,
Mm-hmm.
British ones. Eventually, the British just apparently fired on the colonists and killed 6 of them.
Right, 5. And the thing is, they're not really sure how that shot was fired. What did the soldier whose gun shot off claim happened to him?
He was ordered in the head with a rope club.
He'd been hit, and he had a big bruise on his face to show it, and when he fell, his gun fired. And we watched this trial via the enactment on John Adams, a book by McCullough, and it's very interesting. Do you think that the colonists wanted these guys convicted? The colonists, yes, they did. The patriots wanted them convicted. But John Adams, who was also a patriot, defended them. Do you know why he did that? Yes, Noah.
To uphold the law because he felt they were innocent.
Right. He didn't even know if they were innocent when he took the case, but he said the one thing that a person should never lack in a free country is counsel, having a lawyer to defend them. And he took their case because they deserved to be defended, and he found evidence that they indeed were innocent because they were being provoked beyond what is normal. And also, the patriots were claiming that the captain told his men to fire on the crowd. Did that end up being true? No. So when you were going through this story, who did you want to win? Did you want the British soldiers to be hung, or did you want them to be set free?
Set free.
Set free? Because even if we wouldn't be on their side, it's really interesting that in that case justice reigned, and it was a good thing. What was Sam Adams' role in this whole revolutionary thing? What did Sam Adams do best?
He hyped up the Boston Massacre, making it seem way worse than it was.
Okay, he was a great sensationalist. He really dramatized everything. What was the group he was a part of that was doing this? Yes, Tony?
The Sons of Liberty.
The Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty were doing everything they could to convince people to break away from Britain. And they were making progress, but what happened next really upset Great Britain. It really upset them, and that was when they sent a load of tea to the Boston Harbor to be delivered. What happened to that tea? Yes?
The Sons dressed up as Indians and went on board and threw all the tea off.
They threw all the tea overboard. Tons of good, expensive tea, turning the harbor brown, and so they called it the Boston Tea Party. And Britain reacted very firmly to this, didn't they? They reacted with a great deal of anger, and what was it that they did next as far as acts? The intolerable acts. Now, they're also called the coercive acts, and I believe it was the patriots that called them intolerable. I'm not sure. The British called them intolerable. Let me see if I can find that in here. But they were also called the coercive acts in Britain and the intolerable acts in America. That's what I thought. So the coercive acts in Britain means we are going to make you behave. If I coerce my child to obey me, I physically make them obey. I force them to obey. If I tell my 6-year-old, turn off the TV and get ready for bed, and he just sits there staring at the television, you know, and I say, turn off the TV, I can walk over, pick my child up, he's only 6 years old, take his little arm over to the TV and say, press the off button. Now let's go to your room, and march him down to his room. That's called coercion. I made him do what I said. And their attempt at coercion was to pass some new acts, which the colonists called intolerable. What were these acts? What did they try to do to punish Boston at this time? Yes? They closed the Boston Harbor, except you're a little too enthused about that. You should calm down a little bit. They closed the Boston Harbor. And they also added something called the Quebec Act. I don't know if anyone knows what the Quebec Act is. From the British point of view, the Quebec Act was only an innocent attempt to organize into the empire the area taken from France in the French and Indian War. But when the act extended the province of Quebec southward toward the Ohio River, it cut off claims of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Virginia, and New York to their western lands. Now, many of the colonies had already claimed western land, which is going to end up saving the Union later, and I'll explain how. But they didn't like that. So they were very upset. Did they immediately start war at this point? No, they didn't. They met. And the meeting was called the First Continental Congress. And at the First Continental Congress, John Adams wrote a letter. And this letter was a letter of grievances that they had against England. His letter was called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. And so he said, look, we want to be treated like other British citizens. We're British citizens, right? And the citizens in Britain have more rights than we do. What's with that? And you're passing laws against us, and we don't have anyone in Parliament to represent our part of the country, which is over here, whereas every other part of England is represented in Parliament. You're taxing us without representation. You're being unfair. If you can fix these things, we will be happy and we will stay loyal Britons. The king never even responded to that letter. And in fact, it wasn't long after that that the first shot was fired at the battles of Lexington and Concord, April 1775. So this was not a good thing. We're now at war. And of course, what were those soldiers doing when that shot was fired? Does anyone know?
They were going to basically take away the storehouse of arms and ammunition.
Okay, so they knew the colonists had a storehouse of arms, and they were going after it because the colonists were preparing, just in case. They were preparing. They needed to have weapons for their Minutemen, and their system of defense at this point was called the Minutemen. How did the Minutemen work? How did that work? Yes?
Colony people were trained in basic arms
Mm-hmm.
and would respond if called.
And does anyone know how they would be called?
Oh,
Anyone know? Usually by a loud bell ringing across the countryside. They'd start ringing that bell in a way that meant the Minutemen were to come. And they dropped whatever they were doing and they came right away. And that's what happened when the soldiers started marching for the arms. Now it's interesting. I know enough about this that I just got goosebumps thinking about it, because you all know the story of Paul Revere, right? And he wasn't alone. William Dawes rode with him. In fact, I think Dawes got further than Revere did. Why do we only remember Paul Revere? Does anyone know? Yes?
There was a rhyme written about him.
Yes, a famous poem. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of William Dawes. Is that how it goes? Okay. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. It's done in kind of a horse beat style, and it tells of this whole exciting episode where the colonists were warned. And William Dawes just got left out of the picture. In fact, there was another person involved.
I was
Yes.
going to ask if there was another person.
Yes, there was. I can't remember his name. I think he was a young doctor. He was it a preacher? He was out visiting his girlfriend that night, I think is why he was out so late, but I'll have to check on that story. But those guys rode. How did they know to ride and warn the Minutemen to come? Okay, in the poem it tells you that they're going to hang lights in the tower of the North Church to signal if the British are coming, and the signal also included a message about whether they were coming by land or by sea. Well, they were coming by land, so the signal went. Paul Revere rode through the country saying, you know, call the Minutemen, the Redcoats are marching, and those Minutemen came from everywhere really fast. Now, this was a very sad story because as these men retreated, they were killed and killed and killed on their way back. So this really started war because a lot of men were killed. Why were the British, so many British killed and so many colonists not killed during this retreat? Yes, Tony?
Because the colonists didn't do the typical European warfare where they...
Fighting style. Okay, get this. You're 19 years old. You're told, guess what? You're in the first line of battle. So you get here, you got your red jacket on, and it's got a nice white thing like a target right across your chest, sometimes two, like X marks the spot. And you got your gun, and there's the enemy over there, and now, because you're an honorable soldier, you put your gun down and you start marching toward the enemy. How much chance do you think you have of survival? Not much if you're in the front row, because you just march toward the bullets. Like a brave, good soldier. Well, the colonists had been in America too long, and who had they learned their fighting techniques from? The Indians. And the Indians don't fight that way. The Indians protect themselves when they're fighting. Do you know, have any of you ever seen the bow and arrow video by Lars Anderson? How they could shoot 3 or 4 arrows at the same time, and it's really amazing. I'll show you as part of this class, because those Indians got so good on their ponies, with no saddles or anything, they could fall to the side of their pony. Their muscles were so trained and so hard that they could hold on, so the horse was actually protecting them, and they could shoot 3 or 4 arrows at once. They were amazing, and they also would hide to get their enemy. Well, that's what the colonists decided to do. All the way marching back, the brave British soldiers are marching, and the colonists are all along the sides shooting them down. Well, Britain is furious because they weren't fighting honorably. They were fighting dishonorably. They weren't out in the open where you could shoot back at them, and that was considered wrong. Does anybody do that kind of fighting today? No. No, it's suicide, but that was how they fought in Europe for hundreds of years. 2 armies on each side of the field, and they just start marching towards each other. Now, I'll tell you what, if I was a 19-year-old guy and I was put in the front row, I don't know if I could go through with that. That's pretty scary stuff. But I'd know I was going to die, but I'd have to convince myself it was my duty and I was going to do it anyway. So at this time, we have this war started. We call another Congress called the Second Continental Congress. And in this Congress, they have to decide, what are we going to do? How are we going to fight? We have to have an army. How are we going to get an army? Who's going to lead the army? Who do they choose to lead the army? George Washington. I'm glad you know that. But one of the things we'll be learning as we go along in this section is that right after the war started, there were still a lot of people loyal to Britain and upset. But there was a man who wrote a book called Common Sense. Does anyone know who that was? Pardon? Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine wrote a book called Common Sense, and in a way, it was real common sense. It might not have been as convincing today when we have such high-speed connections and texting and email between us and England, but back then it made a lot of sense. Yes?
Was common sense a term used a lot like how we use it today, or did the term how we use it today come from the book?
I think it was already in use, but I've never investigated that question. But I do think common sense was already in use as a phrase. It's just common sense. It's simply common sense. And I think he chose that because people knew what it meant. And so Common Sense swept the colonies. It was a bestseller. Everybody was reading it. There was over 100,000 copies made of that book. And a lot of people who were just on the fence, not sure what to do, finally said, okay, we should break from Great Britain. And they joined the army. Now, the Second Continental Congress was supposed to manage this war, but they were lacking one of the most important things that they needed to do it. What would that be? Money. money. They had George Washington to lead the army, but an army has to be fed, an army has to be given supplies, and they didn't have permission to tax the citizens to get the money to raise this army. Okay, now how many of you wish that we had no taxes in this country? No taxes. Not me. Why? Okay, let me tell you what you would not have without taxes. You would not have highways that were kept up. You would not have toilets that flush. You would not have people picking up your garbage. You'd have to just throw it in your backyard and build an outhouse. You would not have reliable electricity. How can those things function if they're not paid for? And who's going to pay for them? The people using them, obviously. How can an army defend us if we don't keep that army supplied? If we had to send our young men to fight for us today, but we said, hey, you know, we're not going to help you, but go protect us, they wouldn't have what they needed to do their job. And that's what happened. The Second Continental Congress had no way of getting money. Now, something really important that they did at the Second Continental Congress was they composed the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence was actually signed on July 2nd, 1776. So why isn't that our 2nd of July Day? It was announced on the 4th and read around the country, and the public learned about it on July 4th. Now, we said in the Declaration of Independence, we are a free nation. We disconnect from Britain. Was it true yet? No. We hadn't won our independence yet, but that was the plan, and it didn't get completed until the last battle of the Revolutionary War in 1781. So they wrote this wonderful Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, edited by Benjamin Franklin, and they shared it with the people as their goal, and today we celebrate the 4th of July. Now here's the question I'm going to leave you with at this point. How in the world did this little country with no income for its army go against the greatest power on the globe at this point in history? The sun did not set on the British Empire. It was everywhere. They had the strongest navy in the world. They had trained soldiers going against ragtag men who didn't know what they were doing and deserted at the drop of a pen. But we won. It seems impossible. France helped. That was a really big thing. But even with France, it just seems impossible that these soldiers could have made this a victory. And I'm going to be sharing with you some distinct reasons, one of them being France, why we were able to win. And it's a very interesting story. It's like timing. The timing was very important. Okay, now we've talked about sections 1 and 2 in your book, and we're going to section 3. Did you read section 3, or did you not have an assignment last class because of the test? Okay, tonight you're going to be reading section 3 in this book, How British Power Was Overthrown, and you're going to be answering that question. I want you to look for all the reasons you can find before we discuss them. How in the world did we win this? George Washington created an army, but the army was pathetic. The reports he sent from Valley Forge told how pathetic his army was, how weak, most of it was sick. People, when it came time to harvest their crops back on the farm, they just left the army and went home. There were lots of things going on here that caused problems, and it didn't seem likely that America could win against the great country they were going up against. You're going to be reading how that happened in this. You're also going to be reading a little bit about the contributions of women in the war and what happened to the loyalists. You know, what did these loyalists do when all this was going on? So section 3 is your assignment tonight. We don't have a quiz today, but we will have one tomorrow on 1, 2, and 3. I just reviewed you on 1 and 2, and it will include 3 in tomorrow's lesson.